Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center, sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island. Fieldstone offers innovative and compassionate care and are now accepting residents. They also offer day stare and respite programs. So call 360-689-4314 to schedule a tour of Fieldstone's beautifully appointed apartments on Rolling Bay today. I would also like to acknowledge that we are speaking, and most of us are watching this, on land that has traditionally been tribal land owned by the Suquabs and the place of the clear salt water. Every part of this soil is sacred in the estimation of my people. Every hillside, every valley, every plain and grove has been hallowed by some sad or happy event in days long vanished. Chief Seattle, 1854. So we would like to begin by acknowledging that this land that in which we gather is within the ancestral territory of the Suquab people of the clear salt water, Suquamish people. Expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers, the Suquabs live in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquabs live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. And that brings me right into what I kind of wanted to talk about today to start us off. And please do bring your questions forward if you have them. I have had a number of questions. Part of why I'm going to talk about this is because I've been asked by a number of people about water protection and also about water rights and about the right to harvest on island waterfront properties, the right of the tribes to harvest, to fish and harvest clams and so forth. And they're all really interrelated issues, and they relate to gardening also, of course, because what we do in our yards and gardens on our properties has a huge effect on what is downstream of us. And, you know, I think a lot of the different cities have adopted that saying, we all live downstream, to indicate that we really do need to be sensitive and aware of what happens whenever we turn the hose on at our house, or, you know, water the garden or wash the car or whatever else it is. All those things affect water quality all around us. And that water quality has everything to do with people whose livelihood depends on fishing and shellfish gathering, right? So that is one of the reasons we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And I do hope, as I say, if you have questions, you will jump in with them. Because I think this is a really interesting, if somewhat complicated issue. I have had people talk to me about, can I rip out all the native grasses and plant a big lawn down to the water, for instance? That's one that a number of homeowners have asked. Can I get rid of all that ugly, straggly, the beautiful native vegetation? Yeah. So there's this viewpoint shift for some of us about what is lovely and what is not, what is invasive and what is native. And so some of those issues really depend a lot on your viewpoint, but they actually have some scientifically rooted meaning. So it's good to kind of be aware of the difference between opinion and fact. Who was it, Daniel Moynihan, who said sort of famously, Senator, you're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to have your own facts. We
those days have changed, right, Anne?
I know, right? But I'm still in favor of facts, and sharing that factual reality is important to us as we kind of go forward. I think there's this really deep human desire to be right and to have things that we want be the right thing. But sometimes we have to kind of bend our heads a little bit around the fact that possibly Roundup is not innocuous, for instance. Possibly some of these pesticides have been shown to have really deleterious effects for many, many years beyond the point of use. And people don't want to hear it. Of course not. But, you know, we are an expedient people, and we have to suck it up and be a more responsible people. So I would love to hear your questions again as I go along, because as you all know, I am capable of talking for a great length of time, but I may never hit the thing you want to hear about. So if you have a specific thing in mind, please do let me know. I did want to talk a little again about the issues of waterfront properties that are being renovated and with the removal of native plants. And one of the reasons that's just such a poor idea is that that kind of erosion means if you're putting in a lawn, the lawn chemicals are all going to get washed into the water even sooner. I've also seen quite a few times that people who are living near the shore, on the shore, tend to make big heaps of, say, lawn clippings and leaves and stuff like that, and literally throw them out in the water because that's getting rid of them, right? You're like, actually, it is not a good idea. That kind of lawn clippings and grasses and that sort of thing, a certain small amount of it will get washed into the water by nature, sure. But large heaps of it, no, that's not natural. And it builds up excess nitrogen in the water, which is a heating agent, can actually kill fish eggs, for instance, right? We don't really want to do that. So being really scrupulously aware that the, the ocean is not a dumping ground. I think that's really important. And some people have explained to me very happily that they've been cleaning up their beaches by stripping every single thing off them and getting rid of all the plastic and junk that washes up. And it's like, well, okay, plastic, yes, that's really legit. But when you talk about moving some of the driftwood and things like that, that's a really interesting point. It's kind of like stripping the forest floor in that you are removing part of the natural cycle that's really is a functional part, or should be, and it may not be the groomed, meticulous looking beach you want, but a beach that contains driftwood and so forth is actually a healthier environment. You'll see fiddler crabs living under those big lumps. There's also interesting things like slime molds that contribute to healthy soils on land and healthy water in our waterways and environments. Who knew, right? It's complicated. Reed?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if when we're a waterfront homeowner watching the sea levels rise, what recourse do we have to try to protect that hard, our property, the part that we think of as our property, which of
Right.
course.
And here's the answer, which is hilarious. Plant beach grasses. Yes, those same ones you pulled out, because they're designed by nature to hold those dunes in place, to hold the sand in place. They weave a huge web underground, this really complicated web, which is where those slime molds come in. And the lands that are saltwater marshes are extremely valuable ecologically. So rather than draining those and turning them into an eco-turf lawn that is, I mean, even if it's the best lawn you can design, it's nothing as good as what nature has created, which is that matrix of beach grasses and beach forbs, small annuals and perennials that grow in beachy environments by nature. They're designed to hold back the land against the water. And they are your best defense. And if they're not mowed and they're not chopped out of shape, they're actually really beautiful. If you watch the wind rippling through the mass of beach grasses, it's gorgeous, right? So learning to have new eyes will help you see that that's actually a better protection for your property than trying to have an English lawn right up to the border of the sea. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. It may, we may also need to look at things like, in some places where we've built, it may be difficult to sustain. I'm thinking about places like our friends out on the Spit, who were inundated with the last king tides. And I also know that in lots of beach places like the North Carolina coast, there are a lot of people who have had to build on stilts. So, things are going to change probably.
Well, one thing that's fascinating about that, Reed, is that in many more adaptive cultures than ours, people did build on stilts in such situations because they knew perfectly well that over the course of 20, 30, 50, 100 years, those high tides would arrive, or the storms would come. And we are not adaptive. Even our architects are perfectly happy to design the same house and put it in downtown Seattle or on a beachfront on Bainbridge or in the middle of a farm on Idaho. It's like not acknowledging where we are as a landscape, as an ecosystem, means we don't have any defense against it. We're not only not in tune with it, we're not able to roll with it when stuff happens, right?
It reminds me of John McPhee writing about the Army Corps of Engineers.
Yes, exactly. Immovable force meets nature. Guess who wins? Because immovable forces are not flexible, and natural systems really are pretty flexible, which is great. But I think that reminder that, we do all share the water and we do all share the land. And if we're not sharing, we're really taking on something that is out of our scope that we shouldn't be messing with. And I know that's kind of a hard sell. As a garden designer, I've had this conversation more than a few times. And sometimes you can say things like, well, let's do this. Let's make a hedge of interesting. Our native roses are not beach roses, but in Japan, there are beach roses, which we call the rugosas, and they are tough, hardy, disease resistant. Yeah. They have the most vitamin C of any rose, and there's big, fat, beautiful hips of theirs. And their roots are designed to hold the sand, to lace into the sand with those dune grasses and hold it in place. So if you had a big swath of beach grasses and beach annuals and perennials, and then made a hedge of Rosa rugosa, and they're low kinds that are only 3 or 4 feet high. They're not going to block your bajillion-dollar view. And then you could plant rosemary, a hardy herb from Europe down into Central Asia, which is extremely hardy, and called rosemary means rose of the sea. And it's saltwater tolerant, takes those winds in stride. It's a pollinator heaven plant. So are those rugosa roses. And so you could be kind of easing yourself back from the natural, God forbid, into what could become much more of a controlled environment. And it would be, you'd have that buffer of native plants, adaptive plants, and then you could do more or less what you wanted on that protected inner turf area, except using toxic chemicals, because that really is unacceptable when you're so close to the water. So it rules out chemical lawns. The good news is chemical lawn care doesn't actually do as good a job at maintaining lawns and gardens as natural care does. And it's the same stuff I always talk about. Guess what comes first? Hello, compost, right? So thinking about improving soil that's been impaired by chemistry, because chemical fertilizers were developed largely after World War II by big companies looking for another place to use the chemicals that have been used in ammunition and were no longer in quite so great a demand. So chemical fertilizers do not heal or help soil. In fact, in those days, the soil was considered to be an inert environment that simply held plants upright. Now, there's a huge detachment from the natural world, right? Just that statement alone kind of makes you see the huge mind shift that separated us from the natural world. But those chemicals are still being used by a lot of people. Chem green, really? So if you can get them off the chemistry, you'll find that they don't do so well because the chemical lawns have very shallow roots. Overwatered lawns that have been treated with chemicals typically have as little as 1/2 an inch and as much as maybe 2 or 3 inches of root, which you can see easily when you start removing the turf and rolling it up in sections to start growing, say, a pollinator patch. Now, lawns that have been treated with natural care within 2 years, this is a City of Seattle study, have developed roots as much as 14 and 16 inches deep. So that means that lawn is so much more resilient and so much more disease resistant and drought resistant than the chemically treated water addicted turf, right? So natural care means lay off the chemicals and just start working with nature. So putting down about a 1/2 inch, raking in about a 1/2 an inch of compost every spring and again in the fall, and using a mulching mower. So you mow high about 2 inches, which is like that, and right, it's about my thumb, rather than a 1/2 inch or an inch, and letting the clippings lie. Don't rake them up, but let the clippings rot in place. And that actually prevents red thread. It prevents thatch buildup. So many of the things that happen in a chemically treated, micromanaged lawn don't happen in a natural care lawn, which is pretty cool. So within 2 seasons, you're going to have a far healthier lawn. And one of the interesting things for me is like a healthy, mature, nurtured lawn can actually choke out dandelions. One of the worst problems for dandelion farmers who grow dandelions for market greens is grass, which will get in and choke them. But where the grass is well knit, it actually doesn't really let those plants get established in the same way at all, which I think is fascinating. Now, dandelions grown for the market, if you buy packages of dandelion greens, they're usually upright. They grow like up. right? Because in Europe, those original dandelions, that's their form. And that's, if you go to an Italian market garden, a Greek market garden, you'll find these beautiful, they're chicory basically, upright, succulent, gorgeous leaves. Here, 350 years of mowing has actually developed strains of dandelions that grow flat and have flat rosettes that cling to the ground because it can survive mowing. Now that's an adaptive plant, right? But it makes it much harder to weed and much harder to control and harder to harvest. So one of the cool things is keep your dandelions in your pea patch where you can harvest them for food and get them out of the lawn, right? Because that's not where they belong and they don't really help. I know I've wandered a little further than you probably went there, but I think one of the pieces about the natural care for lawns is that it's so successful. And it makes things much easier because a lawn that has deep roots like that doesn't need more than an inch of moisture in a week, and can do with an inch or less. And most irrigation systems are set to deliver like an inch every other day. So one way to find out if you have an irrigation system, one way to find out what it's actually doing is to get it checked up and running. And by the way, when I went to special classes when I was at Bainbridge Gardens, I was going to nursery management classes and big programs at symposia. And they had special classes on irrigation for lawns. And the first thing they all said was get your clients to get irrigation because it's a guaranteed at least once or twice a year fix. So you're going to be selling and selling and selling all those parts over and over. It's like, what? But yeah, they're not doing it for your health. They're doing it for their health, right? So irrigation in itself is kind of problematic a lot of times. But if you have an irrigation system and you want to know how it's set, get it set up and put out some empty cans of something like cat food or tuna fish, flat cans, and run it for, say, half an hour. And then with a straight ruler, measure how much water is in that can. And then you can tell how long it's taking to deliver X amount of water, right? And once the first year that you get off chemicals and you start going into natural care, or you're trying to establish a lawn or bring back a dying lawn, the first year you're going to have to do a little bit more in the way of helping. So making sure that it's watered probably twice a week that first year, getting those roots to go down, because the more you water, the less incentive there is for those roots to bother, right? Why should they work so hard if you're chumping them, bathing them in water every few days? But if you want them to learn to go down, you have to taper the watering off. The other thing that's super useful is the compost, which helps heal the soil, which makes it easier for those plants to access the nutrients in the soil that will help take those roots down deeper. And that is, again, where slime molds come in. I'm kind of fascinated by slime molds right now. I don't know if any of you have been seeing these incredible photography competitions where slime molds have sort of taken over. They're gorgeous. They're stupendously beautiful. And they're everywhere. At the library, I found like 10 kinds in about 5 minutes. But and they are the knitters, like compost. They kind of knit. So at any given time, healthy soil is about 50% slime mold components. They may be dormant, they may be blooming, they may be rooting, but they're the fabricators that turn regular nutrients and minerals and just whatever, wood detritus and all that stuff. They knit that together and turn it into soil, right? So slime molds are great. I think slime gets a bad rep just because we slime you, right? Everybody says that, but really this is fascinating. It's part of the amazing network under the soil that film, what was it? Fantastic Fungi. I think that film opened a lot of people's eyes to what's going on in underground. And that piece is really important because only when we pay attention to that are we going to be able to understand our role in being healing agents for our properties and the land and the water.
So you started this with talking about water, and you're back there. There's active thinking about, trying to keep your lawn healthy and look at natural processes. But are there ways that we can start to make a more passive way to retain water, to be conservative with water in our lawns, and maybe our landscaping more generally, not just focused on the concept of the lawn.
Oh, absolutely. And the same rule applies because interestingly, again, compost is the best storage agent. Like putting moisture into soil and holding it there is one of the deep principles of like permaculture, for instance, those long-term big ecosystem approaches to gardening and landscaping. So the best way to help your soil hold more moisture without turning into muck or, mud is by using compost. Again, not plowing it, not tilling it, simply layering it on. And all the little creatures that live in the soil will do that mixing for you. They're like teeny weeny shovels that will blend it in. Every time we shovel or till, we actually make a great disturbance, like a tsunami ripping through the landscape. It releases lots of stored nutrients in a flash of, you know, like a very short term flush of nutrients, but then it depletes it and the soil is less able, has the texture of the soil is damaged and it's less able to be storage, good storage for our water, precious water, right? And here in the Northwest, where we have these, well, we used to, and we might still have these wet winters and dry summers, comparatively speaking, our water distribution pattern has been the modified Mediterranean cycle of winter wet, summer dry. Um, Everything's up for grabs right now, but that still seems to be largely true. So one excellent way to store water and help our plants make it through long hot summers or those hot spells is by layering on compost, maybe adding some humic acid. We've talked about that before, granules of humic acid. You can scatter and then put compost on top, and both those things will help open the soil and create a better soil texture. But plants need water and air. So it can't just be sod. I mean, there are bog plants that will live in almost anaerobic situations, but for the most part, what's good for a natural lawn is also going to be good for a natural garden of almost any kind, really. Um, what we want to do is build humus in the soil. Our soils are pretty nutrient rich in this area. We have lots of minerals. We're a little low in calcium, which is why why the snails are so easy to crush here. So, but they're not native here either because we don't have enough calcium in our soils to build good, strong snail shells. And most of those snails have come up from other places on nursery plants and things like that. But to keep the water, the soil well hydrated, one of the best ways we can do that is doing this annual cycle of raking in a ½ inch of compost in a lawn, adding up to 2 or 3 inches even of compost on a bed. For winter prep, I like to put lots of compost on over leaves, mixing fallen leaves with compost and layering them on. And that keeps wind and water from, like the pounding rain can really erode soil very, very quickly. And so bare soil anywhere is just like a dead loss to the natural world. So covering that with this little as a ½ inch of compost helps it not only lock in moisture, but it also begins to function to to sequester carbon almost immediately, which is as little as a ½ inch. So anywhere you have bare soil, think about mulching. You could put down some compost and some wood chips and call that good till you figure out what kind of plant you might want to put there. But anything is better in terms of conserving water and keeping the water downstream of us clean. Anything is better than bare earth.
And when you set this up, when we're talking about what you were going to talk about today, you were saying that the Suquamish have a tradition of being water protectors. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I definitely, when I did the introduction and read the Suquamish land statement, it's right there, right? The people of the clear salt water have always been hyper aware of the fact that their livelihoods and their very lives and the lives of all the creatures in this region depend on clean water. And that is still definitely true. And it's been, since 1989, when the Judge Bolt made his now quite famous decision, tribes have had the right to harvest up to half the shellfish in any given area of tidal land, right? But that means those tidal lands have to be kept clean. And that was sort of my segue into this whole thing, that it's all of our responsibility to help be water protectors, whether we are directly harvesting or not harvesting, and whether we're doing it because we want to be able to promote healthier harvests, or whether we're doing it because we care about the ecosystem and we want healthier beaches, or whether we're doing it because we are desolated when we walk down beaches that 10 years ago were alive with all kinds of critters that are really sparse now. Doesn't matter what your reasons are, they're all good. But the point of it is, if we want a healthy sound, Puget Sound, if we want healthy waterways, it's our job to make sure that we are not actively harming those waterways. I mean, 20 years ago, there was a study in Washington that showed that every major waterway in Washington was polluted with as many as 25 chemicals, and almost all of them were not industrial. Almost all of them were being used on lawns and gardens.
So chemical fertilizers and things that, what do you, insecticides or
Pesticides and fertilizers are the cause of that, which is why I was saying, those are made from armament leftovers. They're not healthy, wholesome ingredients to add to the ecosystem. So trying to get back in balance, it's like, I don't understand myself, because to me, it's all like, it's more natural, it's less expensive, it's easier, it's working with the natural cycles. What's not to love? But there's still a lot of people who want to buy a bag and throw some blue stuff around and call it, like, I know that's going to work because it's pelletized, You're like, yeah. And one of the things to think about with all those fertilizers is a lot of them don't work until the ground temperature is in the 70s. Well, I don't know about you, but it was 29 degrees at my house this morning. It's not 70s now. So this is certainly no time to be throwing any kind of chemicals around outside. Certainly not time to be fertilizing anything. Certainly not time to putting out pesticides. And yet,
but I could sprinkle some wood chips without abandon.
Yeah, not bark, but yes, wood chips. It's very interesting that wood chips and bark are radically different things. And there's well, put simply, wood chips are part of the whole tree. So they include a great deal more of nutritive value than simply the outer bark. It's like, and the thing that comes to my mind is sort of gross, but I worked at the Gold Star packing factory in Denver a long time ago, and was running the line one time, testing package seals, and a bunch of stuff was coming through for the Army, and it was called imitation bologna. And the machine's really loud and it's freezing in there, and I was yelling, "What's imitation bologna?" And the guy's like, "It's beef lips, lady, beef lips." And I was like, so to me, bark is like the beef lips of the plant world. It's just one random piece that there's no use for. So they bob it off on people who don't know any better and make you pay for something that is not really useful or beneficial.
Okay. It's
That's my
okay.
opinion, but it's even a fact.
It's okay. It's okay in small quantities mixed in with the rest of the tree.
Sure.
Yeah.
But
I think Anita might have a point or question.
Anita, weigh in.
Yes, I wanted to help my son get his lawn for, and I know to use compost, but is all compost, like, we'll have to buy compost. So is all compost the same? If it says compost on the bag, is that okay?
No, the great question, Anita. And the answer is no, they're not all the same. And the part of the problem is that there is no compost board. Washington State is unusual in that we do have compost standards, and that most commercial composters do try to meet those standards. And interestingly, like at Safeway, you can buy bagged Carpenita Brothers compost, and it's great. You wouldn't think it. It's better than what you can get at some of the nurseries. It's made locally. Where is it? Rita, you remember, it's like Redmond or something, right?
It's Carpenita Brothers is in Kent, down where my sister lives. And they've got a huge nursery. If you ever go over there, you can buy you can't believe everything you can buy over there. And they've got dirt and fertilizer. They've got compost. They've got all kinds of good stuff.
But for those of us here, or if you have an apartment and you're just buying
Right.
a bag full, you can go to Safeway and get a bag full and it goes on sale for $6. It's good,
Yeah.
good stuff. So isn't that interesting? I also like the EB Stone products. They're from
Yeah.
California. They are always certified and clean. And it really matters because compost is only as good as the feedstock and the processing. Like you can make simple compost at home if you have room that could be just grass clippings and dead leaves, and that would be better than some of the commercial products. But the more varied the feedstock, the more rich the compost will be in terms of nutrient value, to a point. One of the problems with some of the commercial compost production places is that they don't always know what's in the feedstock. And we've had problems in the past with, for a while, there was a lot of clopyralid in some of the compost. It actually destroyed the composting facility at WSU, which they ended up with killer compost. And the only place they could use it was at, what's that racetrack? Is it called Epsom Downs or something? That place in somewhere in South Washington. They ended up using it on racetrack properties because it was just grass, but they didn't even want to use it on golf courses because there's so many birds and stuff. It's ridiculous, really, that such things can happen. But when you're working with companies that have really pretty stringent intake rules, you know that the product is going to be good.
So
We use EB Stone. I use EB Stone a lot at our house, and it's been great.
Yeah, it's it's been extremely consistent, which is important.
and the other one was something Carnita Brothers,
Carpenito.
Carpenita.
Yeah.
I was looking for it at Safeway, but I assume it's seasonal or something, because I didn't see any compost there.
Yeah, it'll be coming in soon. I mean, as I say, it was 29 degrees this morning, so nobody's in, well, you shouldn't be in a big hot hurry to get out there and be doing that kind of thing yet, because it's really too early. And I also was going to speak to and had a number of people say to me, oh no, I'm too late with starting my seeds. And I was like, honey, no, you're not. Last month, I know I mentioned that you shouldn't be pruning your roses yet or things like that, because we had every chance of another cold snap, and hello, here it is. It's tricky in the Northwest because February has traditionally been a very a changeable month that nobody could call. Like all the prognosticators are like, yeah, it's 50-50. It's going to be colder, hotter, warmer, drier. That's not helpful, but it's often the case that we get a January thaw and a February freeze. And so I always tell people, don't be in such a hurry thinking that spring has come, because we used to call it the false spring of February, right? It's like, oh, cool, it's sunny, it's warm, it's actually super cold. That disappointment is echoed in our plants that are also like, whoa, it's way too early to put seedlings out or to start things in the garden. Sweet peas and stuff like that, you still want to wait a little bit. It looks like after this spell, we probably are going to move into warmer weather. And, some people have held that St. Patrick's Day is definitely the day to start your peas and all that kind of thing. I think it's safer because it's like the middle of March, basically, another month or so. And yes, you'll be able to do all those warmer season things.
Could you talk a little bit about that homemade compost? How much work is it? Do you have to have 4 bins and move everything from one spot to another? And
so that's another great question. And the answer, as all great questions have the same answer, which is that depends. The thing about it is, how much room do you have? If you have a lot of land, you can make passive piles. Like at Rita's place, where she's got woods and stuff, she can be throwing, first you start with a layer of sticks and blow down, and then you start throwing on all the stuff you're raking out of the edge of the, to make off your paths and stuff like that. Just throw. You can put grass clippings, you can put leaves, everything will be layered. It won't be big stinking heaps. If you just pile a whole lot of grass clippings somewhere, they get anaerobic, and there's your slime molds again, working away on the inside. You'll find those eager little slime molds breaking it down, but it stinks. And it's not really good for plants. That kind of heat and that kind of degrading process is bad for roots and for foliage and for all kinds of things. So, but layer that, put in a few inches of grass clippings. Even if you just have one bin, a cubic yard is the smallest functional size for a compost bin, really. So if you have pallets, you can put, 4 pallets together, rake up the ground a little at the bottom to scratch it up, and then start layering in an inch of grass clippings, an inch of leaves and stuff out of the garden, an inch of straw, an inch of grass clippings, some dirt, the scraps from your dinner, not meat, not bones, not cheese and fats, but any vegetable kinds of scraps. If you have more attractive scraps, I usually grind them in the queeze, and grind them up as into a slurry, and you can pour that in. No raccoon or rat is going to be interested in that. And it breaks down really fast. You can also do that kind of thing if you have a very small plot. You can do it like in a pea patch. You can cut a trench and start pouring that slurry in every few days and filling the soil in over it, and it will degrade in place. And then the next year, that will be a very rich place to start planting your seeds, right? But if you have a very small place, you can get a teeny worm bin. There's little worm bins with a seat that you can sit on and use as a patio seat, and then feed your food scraps to that. But if you otherwise, think about the green waste, because that goes to commercial composting. And that's another great way for people to handle it if they don't have space. Rita.
And the other thing is when you're making your little heaps, I just do mine out in the yard. Like if we've got a lot of fern, so as I cut them down, I cut them up small, because the more cut edges you have, the quicker they degrade. So I'm a clipping girl, and for me, it's very therapeutic to stand out and, clip things. I can be thinking about what's going on, and I'm outside. So that's just another thing. And it makes a much neater pile, so that you maybe don't need a whole pallet. You can just kind of lay some sticks down, and you can just do it out in the yard.
Well, right. And the thing is that for most plants, their own foliage is stored with the nutrients that plant needs. And so unless you're a very tidy person and if you can tolerate it, generally what I used to call it chop and drop. It's like I pull the dead foliage from something, chop it up, and just leave it around. The roots of any plant are most active at their feeder tips. So not right up at their neck. That's not their feeder tips. Even that's where our mouths are. That's not where the plant mouths are. They're more like at the drip line of where it would be if it was doing its thing in the summer. So often it's a foot away or even several feet away. Or with a shrub or tree, it's going to be out at the drip line, right? A band, maybe a few inches for a small plant, a few feet for a large one. But that's where the action is. So that's where you'd want to put a lot of the chopped up stuff that you're dropping. And Rita's right. And like with the sword ferns, one thing to remember is those fronds and many evergreen foliages are designed to last for 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
So you don't cut them to the ground every year, because you're robbing it of nutrients, and that can actually weaken the plant significantly. But when they start to collapse outward and get starting to brown off, you can cut those to the ground and chop them as Rita's described and scatter them around, and you'll see the birds are going to use them. They get picked and pulled, and that stirs it up, and that's like stirring compost. You're composting in sight. So yeah, there's a lot. And those passive piles I was talking about, you can leave those for several years. And then when you're ready to use it, you kind of shake all those big sticks and move them to the next place. What's left is going to be gorgeous compost, and the soil underneath it will already be open and ready to plant, because all those sifted down nutrients have been working the soil by the biota, by the little living creatures in there, from worms and bugs to all kinds of bacteria. And guess what? Slime molds again, all working hard to open that soil up. And then you can plant into that, take the big stuff and start again in the next site. Yeah. But otherwise, if it's another, 4x4 bin, 3x3 bin, you're going to have to aerate it periodically. And usually what happens is when you first build it, you fill it all up, it starts getting hot, it will cook. And sometimes, like around now, they're steamy. Those piles are steaming. And then they'll gradually cook down, reduced by probably about a third. Stir it up again, same thing will happen. It goes back down. Usually by about 3 times, you're pretty well done. If it's really coarse and there's a lot of stuff in there, you can rub it through a big piece of screen or wire mesh, and then it looks nicer. But otherwise, just put it at the back of the border, or if you don't care, just use it in your veggie garden. It's all going to degrade and be good.
So it doesn't need to be all pretty like mine, because I had a guy garden next to in Washington D.C. and he was forever sifting his compost. Yeah, and I was like never going to get there.
That's how my son-in-law is. So when I cut up the sword ferns and stuff, then I put a little compost over the top of it, so it looks a little neater. Okay, I'm done. Sorry.
No, it's good, but because we represent, Rita and I garden together a lot, and it's really a good combination, because I'm very, let's say I'm carefree, but I'm, go through and I'm looking at all the plants and I feel them and I see what they need, and then I make a mess and Rita comes and she tidies everything up, and everything she does looks great, and everything I do looks very natural. Anita, did you have another question?
There we go. Those a little worm bin, I'm composting, I just have a little balcony. And if I got a worm bin, does it have to come in, does it get too cold here for it in the winter to be out on the balcony?
No, I mean, if it's going to be like 17 the way it has been a few times, you might throw a space blanket over it or something like that. But really, worms are in the ground, right? And in a worm bin, they're in the ground, and that provides a certain amount of insulation. And if there's any snow, they're fine, because insulation and snow holds the soil at about 32 degrees. It doesn't let it get much colder than that. But by putting a light blanket over it or something, you also provide that protection. Marion, it looks like you got a question.
I just wanted to say something about the worm bin. I've had a worm bin for quite a few years because I have a tiny little yard with a green belt behind me. But I've used a worm bin, and I think it was the summer 2 years ago. I just didn't think about it. And when we had all the heat, it literally killed all my worms. I felt so bad. And so that I've never had trouble with the cold, but I guess you could. Some people bring theirs in their garage, but that is a thing to be concerned about now that we've gotten some of these awful temperatures. So
yeah, it's true, especially if it's dry. Dry heat is harder on them. But here's the thing, I'd be willing to bet that over time, what was in there would be full of worm eggs and would repopulate. Because, one thing worms are really good at is getting the, do you know that in this part of the country, there are no native worms?
oh,
Yeah, because this was all glaciated, and after the glaciers withdrew, there were very few native worms. In most of Washington, the most common native worm we have is east side worm called the giant prairie something worm, and they can be like 9 inches long, right? But around here, all the worms that you see in your garden are basically imports, and they're mostly European, interestingly, which have been working their way across the country for several hundred years. They're travelers, right? People bring them in pots, they bring them long plants, they bring, by accident. But worm eggs are in almost all the soils in anything. And so, yeah, you'll find them. Janet had a question on the chat, which about, she said her whole front yard recently became a drain field, and she would like to know how to make a lawnless front area on the drain field. And that is another great question. It depends kind of on what kind of drain field it is. If it's those humps, there's only a few things you can grow on there, but what is it?
No, it's just the whole thing had to be dug up. After about 40 years, it wasn't working anymore. So the whole lawn was dug up. And now I have this giant mud place, and I don't want to put a lawn back in.
Yeah,
I want it
that's
to be
great.
Yeah, I'd like it to be like a rock river, and then mulch around it. But I know you can't plant certain things on top of a drain field. So where can I get the information on that?
Oh, I was just going to say a couple of things since Anne disappeared for a minute. I really recommend this book that I love it. It's called, even though this is backwards probably.
No, it's right.
Real Gardens Grow Natives. And it's written by a woman in Portland, and it's so good. And it has some excellent information on why we should not have lawns
Yeah, yeah.
and among other things. But I just think, I just want to recommend this book so much.
Thank
I want
you.
everybody to have it.
So
No,
Janet
that
was
is a good
talking,
one. And the library does have it. It's a great one to, the
Yes.
library has a lot of books now
Hello.
like that. Yeah, the internet went out for an interesting few minutes.
so Janet was asking about planting on a drain field, and
Yeah.
Rita was suggesting wildflowers or pollinator garden or.
Yeah, and what I was saying was starting with clovers, because annual clovers are such good pollinator plants and they really add nitrogen to the soil. And then you can start thinking about, if you wanted to do a pollinator patch, which would be great, you can make a mix of native annuals and perennials, which there are lots of and they're beautiful. And you could also use things like the hardy herbs. Oregano is really a good one. Rita and I have put in a lot of oregano at the senior center, and it's really
Yes.
resilient and really strong. And it's not only do the pollinators love it, the birds come and eat the seeds. You get goldfinches eating the seeds, and all kinds of the small seed eaters love that stuff. And then you just chop it down once a year and there it goes. And it doesn't care if it gets to be 110 or 17.
What about the
It's just-
depth of the roots though for the drain field? That
It's
concerns
really
me.
shallow rooted,
Okay,
which is nice. You know, it's not a plunger. The oreganos particularly are not. You don't want to plant. I actually was doing a garden consultation with someone who had planted a lot of fruit trees in their drain field. It's like, oh, that's not actually a good plan, because if you think about it, you know, with E. coli being an issue, I don't think that's a good food crop place. But certainly anything that the birds and bees want to go to will be fine. And
I
yeah, there's
have
some-
all my Grosso and Provence lavenders out
Mhm.
there, and they always look woody because there was a big lawn and my lavender was in the perimeter. So what about a couple of lavender plants? I'll dig up
Sure.
my woody ones and they'll be okay.
Yeah, and the thing to keep lavender refurbished, you want to trim it back by about 25% every year, starting when it's pretty
Yeah.
small.
Yeah.
And you do that after the blooms. Instead of just cutting the bloom stalks, take another 10, 15% off, and keep them not quite sheared, but that will keep them longer lasting, because they would live 20 to 30 years unless they get woody too fast, and they don't move very happily or easily. So it's a really good idea to start with young ones. But yeah, those
Can I
rosemary.
go into the wood? Can I dig cut down to the beyond the wood?
No, if you cut down into the wood, it rarely comes back.
Yeah,
But if
yeah.
you cut down to and leave maybe say half the silvery or bluish foliage, that should be fine. It should come back well.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Yeah, but the hardy herbs are always a good place to start because they're good placeholders. And then even things like, you know, mint, which is everybody knows is a runaway, but if you have a big area you're trying to open up and hold, some of the mints are great. They're fantastic pollinator plants. You will see dozens of different kinds of pollinators on all the mints, because many of our native pollinators are adaptive. They're not just very specific. Like, you know, there's blueberry bees that really only go to the blueberry family, but there's other bees, many, 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 and other pollinators too, that are generalists, and they'll go to anything that has nectar, which is great.
Thank you. Sounds
Yeah.
good. Thank you.
I'm getting signals that my internet is unstable, so I don't know. I could disappear again, but hopefully this will work.
Can I say I found some seeds that I thought I haven't done them before, but they're window box sweet peas, and so they're supposed to grow small and then fall over. So I'm going to put them in my window box. They're from Renee's. I just found them. I had never seen them before, so it's just an idea. I'll let you know how they come out.
Well, and actually you can grow any sweet peas in a hanging basket or a window box, because if they don't have anything to climb on, they'll dangle, right?
Right.
And so they'll make
right.
a little cascade, and that's a great way to grow them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of times they'll drop their seeds and then you'll get self-starters later on. Their volunteer plants will appear for you.
Yes.
And peas and sweet peas are one of those plants that you can save seed of, and they'll be good for 3 to 5 years easily, and sometimes quite a bit more than that.
Okay.
Oh, I have a quick question. Sweet peas, I think are poisonous for children, correct?
Yeah,
So, yeah, I was hesitant to plant them. I didn't want my grandson confusing him because he loves garden peas. Okay.
yeah, you definitely want to make that differentiation. It is interesting in the community pea patch I have a bed in. There's one person who grows ornamental sweet peas in amongst her other peas, but once they start making pods, it's really quite obvious which are which. But I personally don't know that I would do that. But I also like to have my sweet peas right up where I can, walk past them every day and enjoy them. Whereas the potting peas, for you, because you have a balcony at this point, right?
Right.
Yeah. So there are some dwarf peas that are dwarf bush peas that are designed specifically for growing in containers. So you and your grandson could have fun with that, right? I was interested, Marion, in the native plant, that book that you were showing. If you look in there too, Janet, you'll find that that book, and a lot of books on native plants to the Northwest that'll be a good resource. But there's also the Xerces Society, which is Xerces, I think, right? Or is it Xerxes? I can't remember. But that is really the longest running invertebrate protection aid group in the world, I think. And they started off protecting butterflies. They were started when the monarch butterfly just started getting challenged, and then have spread to include bees and birds, all kinds of creatures, but mostly butterflies and bees and insects. But they have incredible website information on regional. So you can look up, Washington State, and you can find a lot of native stuff that will be wonderful pollinator plants, and talks about where to grow them. And even Ed Hume seeds. Ed Hume carries like 6 or 7 native annuals in his seed racks, which there's usually one at Safeway. I don't think it's there yet, but it's still pretty cold. But they're inexpensive, $2 for a packet of baby blue eyes. Or California poppies are technically native all the way up into the islands. So that's another. Yeah, there you go. Xerces Society. Thank you, Reed. Really excellent information, and plant lists and other kinds of things like habitat lists. And it really tells you things like, if you make a pollinator meadow, you can't put chemicals on it. You can't mow it all the time. It's like, and also talking about not disturbing the soil too much, because a lot of native bees are ground dwelling. And so if you start digging stuff up and ripping plants out and trampling all over stuff, especially when the soil is really fragile and vulnerable the way it is after a freeze, you can actually be killing hundreds of bees with every lovely footstep. So it's a good time to stay out of the garden for now and not be too darn tidy. Like Rita's idea about chopping, dropping, and adding a little compost is really a good one for people who really prefer the look of tidiness, and have a much harder time with heaps and drifts of plants, of leaves and stuff. If that is disturbing, then I think that idea is excellent to just combine those two ideas, right? And you can even go what Reed said, like scatter some wood chips on top of that. Medium grind wood chips are actually wonderful protection against wind and sun. And in these hot summers we've been having, we have found, like at the senior center, the beds that we got the wood chips on came through those heat spells much, much better and needed less water. And in other areas where we didn't have enough chips to go all the way around, it was much more dried out, and the plants went dormant or died in some cases. So yeah, that could be a very useful technique, because now we're seeing these big swings. Like I grew up in Massachusetts, where it wasn't uncommon to have 120-degree difference between a winter temperature and a summer temperature at all, and even greater than that with wind chill factor. But here that has not been as typical, and the formerly mild weather patterns look like they might not be as strong and stable as they used to be. So we're having to adjust to having those big swings, and our plants are having to adjust too. And we're seeing native plants really struggling. Like if you walk around in the woods, you'll see not only do sword ferns have problems in a lot of places, big leaf maples, Douglas fir, hemlocks have been in trouble for 20 years. Madrones, all kinds of plants that are native and have been here for millennia are not necessarily all that happy about it. And some plants like the Doug firs have only been here for about 10,000 years, and maybe they're not fully adapted. I don't really know. But I think the point is we have to start looking at other ecosystems. And one thing I've been looking at is prairies systems, because one of my friends has a nursery, prairie nursery, this is an awesome catalog. And this is where I'm getting my sweetgrass, which Anita, you and I were talking about. This is one of the few nurseries I know that sells sweetgrass starts that are bigger than a hair, because I bought some before that were almost invisible and they were not very successful. But this is a good reputable nursery. But one of the things they talk about is how, because the water patterns and distribution patterns in prairies are erratic and often dry summers and hot, those plants go way deep. And the owner, Neil DeBall, has a great program he's put on for many years, showing like, here's the plant on the surface and here's all the roots going all the way down, sometimes 30 or 40 feet down into those soils. Well, in prairie soils, you can do that easier than you can in our rocky, hard clay and hardpan. But the point is, those are plants that adapt well. And the whole first section is plants for clay. And there's plants for wet clay and plants for dry clay. And then it's plants for, plants that do well in sandy soils and open soils, in wet soils, mixtures of annuals and perennials for meadows that would be in dry shade, in full sun, in wet soil, all those different things. And they use certified organic seeds, and they're all safe collected, and all the reputable things you would want. So it's a really great catalog. And I thought, it seems weird. Here we are in the Northwest. Why would we look at prairie environments? But Sequim is a prairie environment.
Right.
Snoqualmie has prairie environments. There are prairies and plants. If you drive from here down to Tacoma, you're going through the savanna, right? Grassy savanna with the Gary oaks. So we have lots of environments here. Right, I think I have a question here. The title of it's not a prairie book, it's a prairie catalog, and it's called Prairie Nursery. And so this is their seed catalog and their plant catalog. If you go online, you can find it, and you can request a catalog online and you get it soon. And they start shipping in April. But they're very reputable for quality and being one of the good companies that really pays a lot of attention to where they source things.
Can I ask you a question about my blueberry bushes?
Sure.
They're about 65, 70 years old. We got them when the blueberry farm went out of business in West Bremerton or East Bremerton.
Mhm.
And so I'm concerned that they have so much moss on them and so much lichen growth. Should I just leave them alone?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. That actually is helpful to plants around here. It's part of the natural, it's like an environmental relationship, right? And they do in no harm at all to the plants, and in some ways are protective. Like if it gets especially hot or cold, they provide a certain amount of insulation. They provide nesting to some of the beneficials. They're as they break down, they add nutrients to the soil. So they're just, consider them as neighbors.
I want a really big crop this summer because we have a lot of relatives coming. And so it won't hinder the growth of the berries then?
Oh, not at all. But are you just transplanting them now?
Oh, no. They've been in this house 25 years.
Oh, good. Okay. Because I was going to
brought
say
them from Baker Hill. We had them come from when the blueberry farm went out of business. All the guys at Keyport got about 10 bushes each, and they were huge then, and now they're even, bigger. Question, when should I feed them?
Well, okay, so here's the thing about those blueberries. They like to be moist, and
Yeah, they are.
they don't really like to get too dry. They don't have huge deep root systems, so they could be on the edge of your septic system.
I have a whole area of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they do need some summer irrigation in order to have really good big fruit. The fertilizers that they prefer are very mild balanced, like no more than 5.55. I like that Dr. Earth that's like 2.32 or whatever. There's several different low numbers. And that is really, you don't want high nitrogen for blueberries, because a lot of plants that are going to produce fruit, if you give them a high nitrogen fertilizer, they end up putting out lots of leaves and not as much, not concentrating on the fruiting part so much, right? So you want to promote flowers and fruit, so you want higher middle numbers, middle and last number, and not such a high first number, right?
I've been using the rhodie and azalea fertilizers. Is that okay or not?
Yeah, that's okay. I'd probably also use some kelp meal or liquid kelp for them. And again, remember that their feeder roots are out at the drip line of that plant. Or if you've pruned them, it's out where the drip line would be if you hadn't. Because roots don't care about what you did on top. They know where they're supposed to be relative to what's supposed to be up there, right? So often it would be, you'd be putting that fertilizer, and the compost they really like. Compost is neutralizing, it's kind of buffering. So it wouldn't throw off the pH of the natural soil in any way that would be bad for the blueberries at all. But it's really good for the health of the soil, and it helps them have sweeter berries and fuller flavor for those berries.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Looks like our hour has disappeared. So I want to thank you, Anne, for all the information. And thanks for talking about how important it is that we think about where the water's going and what it's carrying with it.
Well, and I'm going to talk about that more in April, because International Water Day is April 15th and right around Earth Day. And I think those are very entwined. So there's going to be a water fair for Kitsap County. We're going to have some really fun things coming. So I'll talk a little more about that in a couple months. But for now, just before you get started, it's just really good to go into garden season being really aware of our role as water protectors.